The static was not a sound. It was an environment, a texture. For 72 agonizing hours, it had been Eitan's sole companion in the third-floor apartment overlooking Kiriaku-Matsu Avenue. A nest of microscopic, biting insects crawling directly into his auditory cortex. It was the sound of a universe holding its breath, the background radiation of a secret war. It hissed with the friction of empty space, crackled with the potential energy of the void between two specific points on the globe. A listening post perched like a vulture on the wind-scoured Golan Heights, and this forgotten, sun-bleached corner of Nicosia. He was camped in a safe house that smelled of a peculiar, layered history of transient men. The base note was stale Papastratos cigarettes, their cheap, acrid smoke permanently infused into the yellowing, peeling wallpaper, a ghost of 1,000 nervous exhalations. Layered on top was the sharp, metallic tang of cold sweat and, more distinctly, the electric scent of ozone. A dry, sterile perfume emanating from the humming racks of signal intelligence gear that had colonized the small living room like a patient, metallic fungus. The room was a ghost, populated only by him, the silent, winking equipment, and the disembodied voice he was waiting to hear. A voice belonging to a man 600 kilometers away in the Gaza Strip. A man who was, for all intents and purposes, already dead. Eitan was simply waiting for the world, and the man himself, to catch up to the paperwork filed deep within the archives of the Mossad. His sidearm, a Jericho 941F, rested on the edge of the central console, its blued steel finish absorbing the faint, ghostly green light from the monitors. It was the full-sized steel frame model, heavy and uncompromising, a design born of the Israeli desert and proven in its unforgiving conflicts. The weight of it, 1,400 grams of cold, machined reality, was a comfort in a world that had dissolved into waveforms, encrypted chatter, and the abstract calculus of state-sanctioned murder. He hadn't touched it since holstering it upon arrival, but its presence was a constant, a solid anchor to the physical world he was paid to manipulate from a distance. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of 3-day-old stubble like 80 grit sandpaper against his palm. His eyes burned from lack of sleep and the relentless glow of the screens. He was a ghost himself, a temporary resident of this electronic purgatory, his existence narrowed to a single monastic task: listening for a dead man's final words. The target was Yahya Ayyash, known to the intelligence agencies of the world with a mixture of clinical detachment and grudging respect as the engineer. The name was a profound understatement. He was less a man, more a phantom with a degree in electrical engineering from Birzeit University and a self-awarded PhD in the practical application of high explosives to soft targets. He possessed a dark, alchemical genius for turning the mundane into the catastrophic. He could take a household blender, a 50-kilo bag of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, some acetone peroxide synthesized from nail polish remover, and a cheap Casio F91W watch, and transform them into a device that could tear a city bus in half, and with it, the fragile, painstakingly constructed illusion of peace. For 3 long years, he had been the spectral king at the absolute top of Mossad's most wanted list. A wraith who flitted between safe houses in the labyrinthine alleys of Gaza, never sleeping in the same bed twice, never using a traceable line of communication, never leaving so much as a stray eyelash for a forensic signature. He was a creature of pure, disciplined paranoia. But paranoia, Eitan knew from a long and bloody career, was a wall with cracks. It always had cracks, and Mossad was nothing if not patient. They were architects of pressure, experts in finding the cracks and turning them into chasms. A sudden, sharp burst of clarity in the static made Aitan sit bolt upright, his spine cracking in protest like a dry branch. The noise floor dropped away, the pervasive hiss receding like a dying breath into the background. The signal, previously a faint whisper buried under layers of atmospheric noise, was strengthening, blooming from an indistinct murmur into something tangible. Across the Mediterranean, the team in their SIGINT bunker atop the Golan Heights, bouncing the signal off a Sa'ar 5 class corvette lurking in international waters, was locking on. A voice, not the target's, but achingly close to him, materialized from the electronic haze. It was his wife, Bara. Her words were muffled, distorted by the incredible journey they had taken. From a landline in Gaza, up to a geosynchronous satellite, down to the Corvette, across to the Golan, and then relayed here to Nicosia. But their content was clear, relentlessly, heartbreakingly domestic. Something about their son, Bariah, and a school assignment he was struggling with, an algebra problem. The sheer, banal humanity of it was a punch to the gut. Aitan's fingers, long and scarred from a life that oscillated between tedious waiting and brutal action, tightened on the worn Bakelite armrest of his swivel chair. The cheap plastic groaned under the pressure. He glanced at the primary mission chronometer, a large red LED display on the central rack. 7:58. 2 minutes. The world slowed, every second stretching into a taut, vibrating wire of anticipation. This whole operation, codenamed Sundial, hadn't begun with a bang, but with a whisper in a room designed to contain secrets. It had started a year earlier, in a sterile, soundproofed briefing room deep within the brutalist concrete fortress of Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, a building known to its inhabitants only as the Moad. The director of Mossad, a man known by his designated initial, Aleph, had slid a single, thin manila folder across a polished mahogany table that reflected the grim, tired faces of the men sitting around it. The folder was deceptively light, but its contents carried the weight of a national tragedy. It contained the preliminary forensic photographs of the aftermath of the Dizengoff Street bus bombing. Twisted, scorched metal that looked like licorice. Shattered glass glittering like malevolent diamonds on the asphalt. Bloodstains that had oxidized into the color of rust on the pavement and the storefronts of chic boutiques. The faces in the photos were blurred, not by the photographer's lens, but by the sheer, unimaginable force of the blast. He uses his own students as the delivery system, Aleph had said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. He was a small man, perpetually clad in a gray suit that seemed a size too big, but he possessed an aura of immense compressed gravity, like a dying star. He finds the brightest, the most devout at the Islamic University, and he twists them. He perverts their faith into a weapon. He is not just a bomb maker, Aitan. He is a poet of destruction. He writes his verses in semtex and publishes them on the streets of our cities. Aitan hadn't needed the lecture. He hadn't needed the photos. A friend of his daughter's, a girl named Shiri, who was studying cello at the university, had been on that bus. He remembered her laughter, a bright, tinkling sound that filled their small garden during a barbecue just a month before the attack. She had argued with him good-naturedly about politics, her youthful idealism a stark contrast to his own hardened cynicism. She had played Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 for them as the sun set, the mournful, beautiful notes drifting through the scent of grilled meat and jasmine. The file contained a single, clinical photo of a dismembered hand, a silver ring with a small turquoise stone still on one finger. He recognized the ring. He had bought it for her as a graduation gift. He had closed the folder immediately, a cold, hard knot of tungsten forming in his stomach. That knot had remained there for a year, a constant physical reminder of his purpose. He has one weakness, Aleph continued, steepling his long, thin fingers. Pride. He believes he is untouchable, a ghost in the machine, a gift from God to the cause. And he has another, a predictable, deeply human weakness. He loves his father. That was the key. That was the hairline crack in the wall of paranoia. The engineer, for all his meticulous operational security, for all his phantom-like movements, made one concession to sentimentality. Once a week, on a Friday morning, his elderly father, living in the West Bank, would be driven by a trusted relative to a specific public phone booth in his village. At precisely 8:30 a.m., a call would be placed to a trusted neighbor's landline in Gaza. The neighbor, an old woman who believed Ayyash to be a pious scholar hiding from persecution, would then fetch the engineer from his nearby hideout. He would take the call in the privacy of the neighbor's study. It was his only regular link to the world outside the cause, a single, predictable thread in a life of calculated chaos. But you couldn't drop a GBU-28 bunker buster on a neighbor's house full of children. You couldn't send in a Kedon team for a snatch and grab into the heart of a hostile neighborhood patrolled by Hamas lookouts. The collateral damage would be a strategic and public relations disaster, and the odds of Ayyash being there at the exact right moment were impossibly slim. The solution had to be more elegant, more personal. It had to be something Ayyash would bring to his own ear, willingly, even eagerly. The answer was born not in a war room, but in the sterile, positive-pressure clean rooms of Caesarea, the home of Mossad's technological division. The vessel was a Motorola StarTAC 70, the absolute pinnacle of mobile communication at the time. Sleek, foldable, a status symbol even among ascetic fundamentalists. And, once their engineers were done with it, a perfect delivery system for 5 grams of RDX-DX, a highly stable military-grade research department explosive. It wasn't enough to level a building, but it was more than enough to turn the user's head, and everything within a 1-meter radius, into a fine, expanding red mist. The problem, as always, was delivery. How do you give a booby-trapped phone to the most paranoid man in the Middle East? The answer was simple in its audacity. You don't. You have him ask for it himself. That's where Kamal came in. Kamal Hamad, a cousin, a confidant, a man who ran errands and procured supplies for the engineer. He was trusted. He was family. And he was, as Eitan's surveillance file meticulously documented, profoundly, desperately greedy. For 6 months, teams had watched him. They documented his late-night trips to Ramallah, his weakness for Johnny Walker Black Label and the company of Russian prostitutes. Women his fundamentalist cousin would have had stoned without a second thought. They built a file on him, a psychological portrait of a man living in the suffocating shadow of a legend, resentful of his piety, and hungry for a life of Western decadence he couldn't possibly afford. The approach was made not by Eitan, but by a cutout, a Palestinian businessman from Hebron on Mossad's payroll. The offer was laid out in a quiet corner of a smoky cafe. $1 million US. A new passport, and relocation for him and his immediate family to any country in the world that didn't have an extradition treaty with Israel. All for a simple favor. The favor was a 2-act play of psychological manipulation. First, Kamal had to get his hands on the engineer's personal, supposedly untraceable cell phone. Not the one he used for operational matters, but a clean phone he had recently acquired for personal calls, one he thought was sterile. Kamal was to approach his cousin with a worried expression, telling him that he'd heard whispers from contacts in the Fatah-controlled security forces. Rumors of a new Israeli surveillance technology, a passive system that could specifically track the electronic serial number of this particular model of phone, that it was compromised. He was to offer to take the phone to a specialist he knew in Gaza City, a man who could sweep it and upgrade its encryption to military grade. It was a masterful piece of tradecraft, playing directly into Ayyash's dual vulnerabilities, his paranoia and his pride. Ayyash, the master of technology, being told his own device was a liability. His ego would demand he have the best, the most secure. He agreed. The handoff was a nerve-shredding affair in a crowded Gaza market. An event Aitan monitored from this very chair, his heart in his throat, listening to the feed from a microbug planted on Kamal. Kamal, sweating profusely despite the cool morning air, passed the Motorola to a street vendor selling medjool dates. The vendor, another Mossad asset, a man who had lost his family to an errant Hamas rocket, wrapped it in brown paper and placed it in the bottom of a crate. Within an hour, that crate of dates was in a diplomatic vehicle with blacked-out windows, heading for the Erez crossing. 12 hours later, it was in Shira's lab in Tel Aviv. Shira was the antithesis of Eitan, where he was weathered, instinctive, and operated in the gray world of human frailty. She was precise, clinical, a creature of logic and microns. She and her team of engineers worked for 48 straight hours under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. They didn't just gut the phone, they vivisected it. They mapped every circuit on a microscopic level, weighed every component to the 10,000th of a gram. The 5 grams of RDX had to be distributed perfectly so as not to affect the phone's balance or weight, a change a man like Ayyash might notice. The explosive was milled into a fine powder and mixed with a polymer resin, then meticulously shaped using a nanometer scale 3D printer to mimic the phone's internal electromagnetic shielding plate. The real genius, the part that had earned Shira a commendation from Aleph himself, was the trigger. A simple remote detonator was too risky. It could be jammed, or worse, accidentally triggered. Shira's team designed something far more insidious. The detonation sequence was woven into the phone's own hardware. It wouldn't be triggered by an incoming call in the conventional sense. Instead, the SIGINT unit in the Golan would send a specific, silent K-band data packet, a string of binary code just 64 bytes long, encrypted with a one-time pad using a Shamir Rivest-Adelman algorithm, and transmitted at precisely 24.15 gigahertz. That would piggyback on the legitimate voice signals of his father's call. This packet would act as a digital key, instructing the phone's central processor to perform a fatal, unnatural act. To divert the full 3.7-volt charge from the lithium-ion battery directly into a tiny, custom-built tungsten-rhenium alloy filament embedded in the RDX compound. The filament, no thicker than a human hair, would glow white-hot at over 3,000 degrees Celsius for a single nanosecond. That was all it would take. They even replicated the exact pattern of scratches on the phone's plastic casing using a high-precision laser etcher and artificially aged the new battery to match the charge cycle data they had extracted from the phone's memory chip. When they were done, the modified phone was physically, electronically, and aesthetically indistinguishable from the original. It was a perfect twin, a Trojan horse made of plastic and silicon. Getting it back into Gaza was even more dangerous than getting it out. It went back the way it came, nestled amongst a fresh batch of dates. The vendor handed the paper-wrapped package back to Kamal. Aitan, listening from Nicosia through the bug, had heard Kamal's heart hammering in his chest like a trapped bird against a window pane. Is it clean? The engineer's voice, sharp and laced with suspicion, had crackled in Eitan's ear. The best, Kamal had stammered, his voice an octave too high. My contact said the Israelis are getting clever, but this one is now a ghost, completely invisible. The irony was so thick Eitan could have choked on it. Now, in the Nicosia apartment, the final act was beginning. The voice of Bara faded, replaced by the shuffling sounds of the engineer settling into a chair, the scrape of wood on a tile floor. The neighbor's house was a known quantity. They had blueprints, sourced from old Ottoman-era municipal records. They knew he would be in the study, a small room on the ground floor with a single window facing east. The connection is stable, Eitan, a clipped female voice said in his other ear. It was Shira, on the secure net from her lab in Tel Aviv. She was the conductor of this deadly orchestra. Eitan was just the man with his finger on the button. All telemetry is nominal. We are reading the phone's standby signal loud and clear. All teams report green, said another voice, the commander of the SIGINT unit in the Golan. We are tracking the source call from the West Bank payphone. Target is on schedule. Call initiated. Eitan's mouth was as dry as the Negev desert in August. He took a sip of lukewarm water from a plastic bottle. He could feel the sweat trickling down the channel of his spine, cold and clammy against his shirt. He was a killer by proxy, a puppeteer pulling strings of life and death from across an ocean. He listened to the quiet breathing of the man who was about to die. He heard him sigh, a sound of weary contentment. Did he think of his son, Bara, and his algebra homework? Did he think of the young men and women he'd sent to their deaths, their bodies turned into delivery systems for his poetry of destruction? Or did he just think about the simple, human pleasure of talking to his father? The seconds stretched into millennia. 8:25, 8:26. Eitan's gaze was fixed on two things: the digital chronometer on the console and the primary audio waveform monitor, an oscillating green line that was the graphic representation of Yahya Ayash's life. At 8:28, a new sound entered the feed. The unmistakable tinny monophonic ring of a Motorola StarTAC. It rang once, twice. Eitan's own heart hammered against his ribs in perfect, brutal time with the rings. Then, a click. The line went live. Abba? Ayash's voice, clear as a bell. Father? It was the trigger phrase. The call was confirmed. He was on the line. Yahya, my son, can you hear me? An old man's voice, faint and reedy with age and distance. Yes, Abba, I can hear you perfectly. The connection is excellent today. How are you? How is your health? The conversation was mundane, achingly, horribly normal. A son talking to his father about the old man's arthritis, about the price of olives at the market, about a cousin's upcoming wedding. Eitan felt that cold knot in his stomach tighten into a fist of ice. This was the part they never showed in the recruitment videos. The intimate, squalid reality of the job. You didn't just kill a monster, you killed a son, a husband, a father. You bore witness to his last moments of tenderness, and you became the god who decided they would be his last. Golan, confirm you are locked on the carrier wave. Shira's voice was pure ice, cutting through the domesticity of the scene. Locked and tracking, solid tone at 832.45 megahertz. We have him. Eitan, Shira said, her voice now directly in his ear, a private channel cutting out all other chatter. The window is optimal. He is holding the phone to his left ear. Our thermal imaging from the drone confirms his position. He's alone in the room, seated, facing east. Eitan looked at the green line on the monitor, pulsing gently with the engineer's voice. He was talking about the olive harvest. He was laughing at something his father said. A genuine, warm laugh. The laugh of a man who had no idea that his own skull was now, effectively, a bomb casing. "It's your call, Eitan," Shira said, her voice betraying not a hint of emotion. "Give the word." This was it. The culmination of a year of planning, of thousands of man-hours, of millions of dollars. The ghosts of the Dizengoff bus, of Shiri and her stolen future, whispered in the recesses of his memory. He thought of his own daughter, safe in her university dorm in Haifa, and a wave of cold, clarifying fury washed over him, cleansing the last vestiges of doubt. He was not an assassin. He was a surgeon, excising a cancer. He took a deep breath, held it, and keyed his microphone. His voice, when it came, was steady, a sterile instrument of state policy. "All stations. This is Sundial. We are go for activation. On my mark." He listened to one more second of the conversation. The old man was telling his son to be safe, to trust in God. "Stand by," Eitan said, his eyes on the chronometer. The engineer replied, his voice full of warmth and confidence. "I am always safe, Abba. God protects me." 3. A world away, a technician in a darkened room in the Golan Heights poised his finger over a single key on a terminal, initiating the transmission of the 64-byte kill packet. 2. In the Mediterranean, the sailors on the INS Eilat had no idea that the powerful communications array they were pointing at the Gaza coast was about to become an assassin's weapon, a relay for a digital bullet. 1. Shira, in her lab, watched a string of hexadecimal codes scroll across her screen, a digital angel of death waiting to be released into the ether. Eitan closed his eyes. "Mark." He didn't say execute or send it, just mark. A single sterile syllable to end a life. For a fraction of a second, an eternity, nothing happened. The conversation continued. "And tell Umbara I send my love." Then, the green waveform on Eitan's monitor vanished. It didn't trail off. It was simply gone, replaced by a flat, dead line. Simultaneously, a sound erupted in his headset. Not a boom, but a sharp, percussive crack. A microsecond of acoustic overpressure that sounded like a dry branch snapping inches from his ear. It was followed by an ear-splitting roar of pure, white noise static. It was the sound of a microphone, a speaker, a processor, and the man holding them being instantly and simultaneously atomized. Silence. The only sound in the Nicosia safehouse was the low, steady hum of the electronics and the frantic pounding of Eitan's own blood in his ears. He opened his eyes. The green line was gone. The ghost was gone. "Signal terminated," the Golan commander reported, his voice tight with adrenaline. "I say again, target signal terminated at 8:31 and 14 seconds. "Drone is confirming," Shira added, her voice betraying the slightest tremor of excitement or relief. Eitan couldn't tell. Visual from the asset on the ground. 1 moment. The pause stretched for an eternity. "We have confirmation. Smoke from the east-facing window of the target room. Neighbors are emerging. It's chaos." She paused again, and he could hear the rustle of paper. "Target is neutralized. Repeat, Operation Sundial is successful. Congratulations, team." Eitan slowly, deliberately, took off his headset and placed it on the console. The silence of the room was a physical weight, pressing in on him. He felt no elation, no triumph. Just a profound, hollow emptiness that rushed in to fill the space the static had occupied for 3 days. The static was gone, but the silence it left behind was infinitely worse. He had listened to a man's last, loving words to his father, and then had him murdered with a word. He had turned a son's affection into a weapon of war. He stood up, his joints aching from disuse, and walked to the window. He pushed aside the dusty blinds and looked out over the sun-drenched rooftops of Nicosia. At the normal people hanging laundry, driving to work, living their normal lives, oblivious to the secret wars being fought in the static between their phone calls. He had made the world safer for them, for his family, for his daughter. That was what he would tell himself. That was the story he would use to fill the silence. He was a surgeon. He had removed the cancer. But surgeons washed their hands after the operation, scrubbing away the blood. Eitan knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this blood would never come off. Weeks later, back in Tel Aviv, the debriefing was a formality. Aleph poured him a glass of Lagavulin 16, a rare indulgence, its peaty, medicinal aroma filling the director's expansive, quiet office. The city was a muted tapestry of light and sound beyond the triple-paned, bomb-proof glass. "A perfect operation, Eitan," Aleph said, raising his glass. "Clean, precise, a scalpel, not an axe. The organization is in disarray. They're eating their own, looking for the traitor. You've set them back a decade." Eitan took a long swallow of the whiskey. The burn was a welcome, grounding sensation. "What about Kamal?" he asked, his voice flat. Aleph swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on the vortex within, avoiding Eitan's gaze. "The asset has been compensated according to our agreement. He and his family have been resettled." "Where?" Eitan pressed, though he already knew the answer. "That's on a need-to-know basis, Eitan. You know that better than anyone. He's safe. He has his new life." Aleph's voice was smooth, practiced, the sound of 1,000 such justifications. Eitan stared at the director, a man he had known for 20 years. He could read the subtle tells that a polygraph would miss, the slight flicker of an eyelid, the almost imperceptible tension in the jaw muscles. Aleph was lying. It was a perfect professional lie, but a lie nonetheless. He was a loose end, wasn't he? Eitan said, his voice barely a whisper. He knew too much. He could have talked. $1 million can make a man very talkative. Aleph took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey before answering. He placed the heavy crystal glass down on the mahogany desk with a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo in the silent room. Kamal Hamad was a patriot who helped us remove a great evil from the world. He was rewarded handsomely for his service. That is the official record. That is the only record. Eitan felt the coldness spread from his stomach through his entire body. It wasn't in the words Aleph said, but in the ones he didn't. There would be a news report in a few weeks, a small item from a wire service buried on page 12 of the international section. A Palestinian businessman killed in a car bombing in Buenos Aires. A deal gone wrong. Or perhaps a tragic boating accident in the Aegean, something messy, untraceable, deniable. The $1 million would be an inheritance for a family who would never know the truth. Mossad paid its debts, but it also buried its secrets with ruthless efficiency. He had orchestrated one death, but he was responsible for 2. Kamal, the greedy, foolish, trapped cousin, was just as much a casualty of Operation Sundial as the engineer himself. He was a tool, and when the job was done, the tool was discarded, broken, and buried. Eitan finished his whiskey in one gulp and stood to leave. He looked at his own hands. They looked no different. They were the hands of a husband, a father. but they were also the hands that had typed the memos, that had approved the surveillance, that had held the headset and given the final, fatal command. He was a katsa, a handler, a man who dealt in the souls of others. He had bought one and extinguished another. "There's one more thing," Aleph said as Eitan reached the door. Eitan paused, his back to the director. "Kamal's resettlement, the new passports, the funds. They're being managed by our station in Canada. His wife and children are being monitored. They're a potential asset now." Eitan turned slowly, the cold in his gut turning to ice. "An asset? For what?" Aleph looked up from his desk, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "For leverage. Should we ever need to convince another man in their extended family to see things our way, a cousin, an uncle. People are predictable. Family is always the key." The echo of the operation wasn't just a sound in his head. It was a new file, a new set of lives held in the balance, a new tragedy waiting to be written. He hadn't just removed a cancer. He had seeded a new one. He had taken a greedy man, turned him into a traitor, had him killed, and then turned his grieving, innocent family into a weapon in waiting for the next war. As he walked out into the warm Tel Aviv evening, the city was vibrantly alive with the sounds of traffic on Ibn Gabirol Street and laughter spilling from crowded cafes. He saw a father lift his young daughter onto his shoulders, and for a terrifying second, he saw Yahya Ayyash and his own father, and Kamal and his children, all overlaid in a single, nightmarish image. He had removed the monster from the city's nightmares, but in doing so, he had become the architect of new ones. He had created a ghost story that would not end with a single death. The static was gone from the headset, but he could hear it now, in the silence between his own heartbeats, a permanent hiss promising that the cycle would continue, and that he was now, and forever, a part of its engine.